Armstrong, you heard the statement from CARE right there. Let me ask you this. There's anywhere between 2 and 7 million Muslims in the United States right now. Maybe 2.7 million is one estimate I've seen. What would you say to those kids born in America who happen to be Muslim? Would you tell them that Dr. Ben Carson, and what happens when Ben Carson becomes president? Will he tell these Muslim kids that I don't think you should grow up to become president of the United States?
Where was CARE after 9/11 when there was those images of those Muslim kids in the classroom rejoicing and cheering at the falling of those buildings and our men and women died? Where was CARE? Where was CARE when what happened at Fort Hood when someone in the name of Islam killed our innocent men and women? Where was CARE? Where is CARE now with our journalists overseas who are being held by Iran and Daniel Pearl, who was beheaded? Did they have a press conference condemning those actions
Armstrong?
and that kind of behavior? Where were they?
Let's leave CARE out of it then. If you don't want to listen to CARE, leave CARE out of it, and let's talk about the other folks who have spoken up over the last day. I just want to know, again, the parameters and how far Dr. Carson's beliefs go on this. And I want to know, and I think it's important, because if he is in the White House, he sends a message to the entire country, young and old, men and women, Muslim, Christian, and Jew. Would he tell Muslim kids that he does not think they should grow up or could grow up to be president of the United States?
I know this is a very sensitive issue for many people. Dr. Carson is a person who has a very strong belief system that is inclusive of everyone. And you don't arrive at these positions where you say honestly that you don't want to see a Muslim as president of the United States. In no way would he want to hurt or offend or make any child believe that they could grow up and not become president of the United States. That's not who he is. And we understand that's a perception, more than a perception, that is reality for children, and it's not intended that way. But as I mentioned earlier, when you see those images after 9/11 with those young kids cheering in that classroom, it reflects their parents. What we need to do is talk about how we be more accountable in whatever we believe in, that the Muslim community, and many do it, some just don't do it enough, and talk about how the destructive tenets of Islam and Sharia law and how it disrespects women, have no regard for women, how it has no regard for many Muslims who flee from these different parts of the world that come here to find a better way of life. And while this is not easy and his heart would go out to these kids, still, because of how he feels in his heart about what it means when you're president of the United States, the kind of power and authority and how literally you can change the world, he has to come to the conclusion for what is best for America. And because of his love for America, that in his heart of hearts, he could never advocate for a Muslim becoming president of the United States. He just can't.
And so in the here and now, you said before we went to commercial break that he's not a politician, he's not putting his finger to the political winds to test the political winds. But we need to be clear exactly then on what Mr. Carson believes. You say his intent is not to offend, his intent is not to hurt, but he does believe that there is an entire religion that he does not think should have equal rights in the United States.
You call it equal rights. You call it religion. It is not religion. It's what an individual believes. And what an individual believes impacts how America is governed and what we become as a nation. And while you may find that it's totally out of character for a presidential candidate to express these kind of feelings, what I don't think you realize is there are many Americans, if they search their hearts, they believe the same thing. They don't want to believe it, but when they look at the world and look at how Islam has become polluted and what is happening in Europe and in the Middle East and around the world, you have to take time to pause and ask, what is happening to the world? Would we want to see this in America where people use our freedoms and our rights and the fact that the freedoms of expression and our freedom of movement, and they use this against us? And so Dr. Carson does this not of dislike, not of disdain for someone, because he loves America so much. He feels that you have to protect America from those that would want to destroy it because of what they believe in.
But isn't that
It's
a
not
vast
religion, it's what
generalization
they
that
believe.
you wouldn't want anyone to use against Dr. Carson for anything that makes him unique? Isn't that a vast generalization to say that because of a radical sect of a religion, you want to say not a single person of that faith, as John points out,
2.7 million, not
2
one
and
in
7 million
2.7
people
million, yeah.
should be allowed to hold this office?
That is their choice. That is the beauty of
What's
freedom.
their choice?
Freedom to vote. It is their right not to vote for Dr. Carson. That is a small price he's willing to pay, and for what he believes and what he will not advocate.
Well, you say it's their choice not to vote for Dr. Carson. That, of course, is a separate issue. What you were saying, what Dr. Carson is saying, that these people are not qualified based on their religious belief, based on how they pray to God, not to be in the White House. Do you think all 2.7 million Muslims in America advocate those views that Dr. Carson finds objectionable? Or is the mere adherence to any kind of Islam disqualifying?
Dr. Carson would not today, yesterday, or next week advocate having a Muslim in the White House as President of the United States. It is that simple. It is that clear. There's nothing else to discuss.